Welcome, everyone. I'll be talking to you for the next few minutes about the beginning of the Middle English period. Let's begin. Edward the Confessor reclaimed the English throne for the English after 26 years of Scandinavian rule. When he died childless in January of 1066, there was a bloody, epic contest for the crown between an Englishman, a Norwegian, and a Norman. Before I go any further, you'll need some context so that this conflict makes sense. Harold Godwinson, a native Englishman, was Edward's closest advisor. Just before his death, Edward named Harold his heir, and Harold assumed the throne for a few brief months before challengers appeared. King Harold of Norway saw himself as the heir of Knut and Harthonut, the Scandinavian kings before Edward. Okay, and so he fought for his claim to the throne. And then there's William, Duke of Normandy. He also laid claim to the throne because he was the cousin of Edward the Confessor. And when Knut and Harthonut ruled England, Edward sought refuge in Normandy, which is part of France, with William. He took this favor to mean that he would inherit the English throne when his cousin died. So when the two Harolds met in battle, English Harold was victorious and thought he would retain the English crown. Ultimately, however, he was killed and his forces defeated at the Battle of Hastings in October of 1066. William claimed the throne and ushered in what linguists call the Middle English period. Cultural changes took immediate effect, but it took a while for Old English to change to Middle English. As so many linguists point out, peasants in Northumbria didn't wake up, grab a newspaper and say, "Look at that, William of Normandy won the Battle of Hastings. It's time we start speaking a different way." That's ridiculous. But it's true. Linguistic change was gradual. Okay, so let's talk about this William, Duke of Normandy, for a moment. Okay, so the Conqueror was a bastard son of Robert the Devil, who took such pains in the early part of his life to earn his surname that he became a figure of legend. Among other things, he was accused, doubtless justly, of poisoning the brother whom he succeeded as Duke of Normandy. Okay, so Robert the Devil, it works. So great was his capacity for rascality that he was also called Robert the Magnificent. Ironically, he died in the course of a holy pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Robert's great-great-grandfather was Rollo, a Danish chieftain who was created first Duke of Normandy after coming to terms satisfactorily to himself with King Charles the Simple of France. William's mother was simply a tanner's daughter. William is alternately referred to as the Conqueror, the Great, and the Bastard. He became the Duke of Normandy at the age of 6 to much distress from the upper ranks of society, and he escaped several murder plots as a lad. William's success at Hastings can certainly be attributed to military skill, but luck and good timing also played a role. The battle between Harold Godwinson and Harold of Norway ended on September 25th, 1066. On September 28th, so 3 days later, William landed in southern England at Pevensey near Hastings with a large force. In order to meet this attack, Harold of England was forced to rush down from northern England immediately following the battle with Harold of Norway. With his army in disarray and his supporters slow in coming to his aid, the two met in battle on October 14th, 1066. Eventually, William would be crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day of 1066. Given these conditions, it's no surprise that the Norman forces were victorious. William the Conqueror was crowned king, and the cultural changes were fairly swift compared to the linguistic changes. William replaced the entire English nobility with his loyal friends from France to ensure there would be no backstabbing or threats from the English lords. Naturally, the former high-ranking members of English society were a bit disgruntled. William ordered many castles, keeps, and other structures, including the Tower of London, be built early in his reign. He wanted strong, reliable structures nearby so that he and his Norman supporters could retreat to safety in the event of an attack. William found that the English government was quite a bit more complicated than what he left behind in Normandy. There were many divisions in the land with multiple officials and protocols for each area. To better understand his kingdom, he commissioned the Domesday Book, which would account for all property and citizens in the entirety of England. It was, of course, too large a project to actually be completed, but it's noteworthy as the first attempted census in English history. Because William, like the following Norman kings, split his time between England and Normandy, where he continued to rule, his reign was extremely well documented, as so many of his orders and proclamations had to be recorded in writing and delivered to the kingdoms. The biggest cultural and linguistic change due to William's victory is that England became a diglossic system. In other words, two languages were spoken in the same area at the same time. Remember that word, diglossic. We'll talk about how French changed English in a future lecture, though. Okay. There are several significant linguistic changes that happen over the course of this period, but first and foremost, I want to point out that we're moving toward modern English. It won't happen at once, but you'll find over the next few weeks that historical grammar and vocabulary will start to be simplified and seem more familiar. One significant change was vowel reduction. Long vowels in this period were called such because of the quantity of their pronunciation or length of time to say them. Vowels in the Middle English period started to take less time to pronounce, and unstressed vowels became more common. Short vowels, however, saw few changes in the period. Vowel reduction and its accompanying phonological changes were a major factor in the leveling or simplification of inflections. First, unstressed vowels merged and were reduced to schwa, which you'll remember from week 1 is a generic unstressed vowel sound like the in sofa or in so. You guys know what I'm talking about. Next, final E's were silenced and extraneous medial E's were lost. So phonetic change and analogy led to the breakdown of the inflectional system. Nouns and verbs were reduced to a basic pattern. In this system, there were far fewer categories to consider when declining nouns. Plural nouns were marked generically with an or en, as in modern oxen or children. A Middle English example we won't see today is shown. Interestingly enough, the s or es ending that we're familiar with today to pluralize a noun was the standard declension in the innovative Northern English dialect. Right? Case or grammatical function was only declined in the singular, and cases were reduced to 2. Genitive or possessive, and common case, which is everything else. Old English verb classes appeared with few losses. There wouldn't be too much substitution or replacement until later in the Middle Ages. However, when new verbs came into English, they were conjugated as weak verbs, even if they held characteristics of a strong verb. This would be like a modern English speaker applying the regular verb conjugation rules to an irregular verb. So, for example, if I said he swimmed instead of he swam. It sounds strange to us, and this shift might have sounded strange to speakers at the time as well. Demonstratives, adjectives, and prepositions also underwent notable changes. Old English demonstratives, this, that, those, and so on, I'm sure you'll remember, were inflected for number, gender, and case. Later Middle English texts, however, showed these declensions greatly reduced. Adjectives actually showed the greatest change during this period. Old English adjectives like demonstratives were also declined for number, gender, and case, but Middle English adjectives were only declined for number. And adjective inflections ceased entirely around the start of the 14th century. As inflections were simplified, more prepositions and function words were introduced into English from French and Old Norse to convey meaning and relationship between words. Finally, let's turn to orthography, another term you need to know, or the conventions of spelling and writing in a language. When English began to rise to prominence again at the end of this period, more on the relationship between English and French in about a lecture or two, there was no standardization or standardized pronunciation or spelling system. The pseudo-standardization of West Saxon changed over centuries of Norman rule when English was a substratum language. Remember, substratum is not the prominent one. English was written individually by scribes in their own dialects. These scribes, by the way, had been trained in writing Latin and French, and so they imposed many of the Latin and French conventions on English texts. Chancery English, which begins to be written from about 1415, is the form of London English employed by scribes in the early 15th century Chancery, which was situated in the street known as Chancery Lane. The wider adoption of this spelling system during the century was partly the result of its status as an official language, partly from the volume of documents written in it, and partly from the acceptability of the dialectal mixture from which it was composed. That was a lot. I understand. Listen to the video again if you need to get clarification on anything. But we're going to shift and we're going to start talking about grammar, and we're going to talk about influences, and we're going to talk about, of course, literature. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Have a great day.